Her satisfaction was evident in her gaze as she smiled, asking, "That was incredible. So, when do we meet again?" I chuckled, replying, "I'll call you soon." She leaned over, gathering the stack of $100 bills from the nightstand. Pausing briefly as her eyes fell on the smaller pile beside it, I said, "Take it as a tip." Grinning, she scooped up the extra cash, giving me a quick peck on the cheek before departing. Just before she reached the door, she turned, saying, "Merry Christmas." Her cold, transactional demeanor shattered any illusions I'd harbored, alone in that Las Vegas hotel room. The emptiness hit me hard. There was no love, no companionship, just an expensive escape. "Merry Christmas," I muttered under my breath, rolling over and drifting off to sleep. Waking up, I reviewed the weekend's events. Even with last night's splurge, I still had a $3,500 profit from blackjack. My goal had been $5,000 by week's end, but now the challenge felt steeper. Every Vegas trip followed my strict playbook: blackjack only, no drinking when tired, remaining inconspicuous, spreading my bets across casinos, and leaving as soon as I hit my target. I had my tricks: altering my appearance, shifting my goals, avoiding high-stakes tables. I liked the $10 minimum bets. Sometimes I'd deliberately lose, make foolish plays, order a drink, and pretend to be just another reckless gambler. I never cashed out all my chips at once, keeping the staff off my trail. Yet I knew it was only a matter of time before they caught on and ejected me. I possessed a knack for numbers and a memory that never missed a detail, making me adept at card counting, a skill casinos considered cheating. The risks were clear. I'd started out of desperation, needing money badly. Now, it was about recouping my losses, though I knew some things, like my career and Sandra, were gone for good. I'd been a respected math professor. Now, every decision hinged on whether to hit or stand. Sandra's betrayal and manipulative arrival had devastated me. Considering it all, I wondered how much longer I could maintain this charade. I recalled my first day at the university, stepping onto that vast campus as a new, hopelessly lost assistant professor, searching for the math department. A student eventually guided me through the maze of offices to meet the head of the department, Dr. Henry Marshall. After a hesitant knock, a booming voice invited me in. Behind a desk piled high with papers sat an older man with a wide smile. "You must be Andy," he said. "Let's grab some food and a Guinness. On me, of course." That was my first encounter with Dr. Marshall. Over lunch and a few beers, he told me to call him Hank and introduced me to almost everyone in the department. The next morning, slightly hungover and uncertain, I returned to his office. Hank, never one to lower his voice, reviewed my course load and gave me a comprehensive overview of the campus dynamics. The English department clashes with Spanish. Nobody cares much for French. And the German department is like a mythical creature. Few have seen it. Oriental languages are up-and-comers. Chemistry gets along with biology, but not botany. Astronomy is laid back. History minds its own business. And political science is a rabble-rouser. Sports teams are terrible but rolling in money, he said, amused. At lunch, he took me to a local biker bar, where he was a regular, known for restoring motorcycles. His current project, a 1940 Indian chief, was eagerly anticipated by everyone. After an afternoon of heavy conversation and beers, I stumbled home, half-jokingly wondering if my liver would survive Hank's mentorship. The following morning, still foggy, I found my way back to Hank's office. "Andy, I was about 50-50 on whether you'd show up with a tattoo today," he joked, clearly pleased. He immediately began discussing student orientation and his hands-off management style, which gave professors considerable freedom. Eventually, he led me to my new office, offering his assessment of each classroom. "The acoustics in your main room are dreadful, but the lousy heating will keep them awake," he said with a smirk. He explained that office location indicated rank within the department. Down the hall, we saw a maintenance worker painting the door of what was marked as Dr. Evan Doyle's office. Hank, clearly annoyed, asked what was happening. The worker replied that he'd been instructed by Hank to reallocate the office. Hank, frustrated but calm, told him to unlock the door. Inside, the office was decked out with plush furniture, stylish decor, and the latest equipment, including a brand new computer. Hank looked around, then turned to me. "Looks like Dr. Doyle used his whole budget redecorating your office, Andy." "Congratulations," he said. He then instructed the worker to change the locks and ensure Dr. Doyle had no access. "No one's moving a thing without my approval," he insisted. "The nameplate will read Dr. Andy Miller." As we walked away, Hank added, "I've placed you right in the middle of a power struggle with our associate professor, but don't worry, he'll learn his lesson." I frowned, realizing I hadn't yet met Dr. Doyle. "That's because he ignored my invitation to the meet and greet," Hank explained. "Probably thought he was above it." I chuckled on Thursday. Working in my new office, I heard the door handle rattle. Opening it, I found an angry man glaring at me. "What are you doing in my office?" he demanded. "Good morning," I replied, extending my hand. "You must be Dr. Doyle. I'm Andy Miller, the new assistant professor." He ignored my hand and repeated, "Why are you in my office?" "Dr. Marshall assigned this space to me, along with the furnishings," I answered. Doyle's face reddened as he launched into a tirade in the hallway, hurling insults at Hank. "I don't care what that old fool said. You're out," he spat. I remained calm. "I'll leave if Dr. Marshall instructs me to," I said evenly. He fumed, claiming I'd be out in 10 minutes, and stormed off towards Hank's office. Hank's secretary, Deb, had witnessed the whole scene, so Hank was well prepared when Doyle reappeared 30 minutes later. Doyle returned, sneering. "I'm here to collect my furnishings," he hissed through gritted teeth. Dr. Marshall explicitly stated that he alone could authorize any removals, I told him, sparking another outburst from Doyle. Finally, I suggested, "Why not join us for lunch with Dr. Marshall to sort this out?" Doyle shot back with a bitter, "Go screw yourself." I locked my office and made my way to Hank's office. He promised to introduce me to the best burger joint in town. As I bit into the burger, I had to admit it was the best I'd ever tasted. Over a beer, Hank and I shared stories about Doyle's recent antics. It was obvious neither of us would be on his Christmas card list. On Saturday, Hank hosted a faculty gathering at his home. I arrived early, wine in hand, and was greeted by his wife, Maggie. She graciously accepted the wine, introducing me to everyone. Between conversations, Maggie shared stories about Hank that deepened my respect for him. She confided that they couldn't have children, a hardship that had drawn them closer, though it also left them wondering about what could have been. At one point, she said Hank thought of me as a son, which genuinely moved me. "Well, only Maggie can get folks all teary-eyed," Hank laughed, appearing behind us. He then led me to his pristine workshop, where he showed off his meticulously restored 1940 motorcycle. "Something this remarkable deserves a second shot," he said proudly, explaining the bike's journey from junkyard relic to gleaming masterpiece. I couldn't agree more. As the night wound down, Maggie kissed me on the cheek, warmly inviting me to dine with them any time. Hank added with a wink, "I already see too much of you during the week, so no weekend invasions," and suggested, "Though you might let me help restore my latest bike project on Saturdays." That first semester, I relied heavily on Hank's guidance and soon regarded him as a mentor. We established a standing Thursday lunch, and by the second week, he insisted on treating. I started to find my footing in the classroom, diving deeper into theorems and mastering the material. Numbers had always been my strength. I'd been labeled a math nerd back in high school, through undergrad, a master's, and my doctorate. I'd turned down various job offers, choosing instead an assistant professorship to focus on research alongside Hank. Together, we spent long afternoons working through equations and eventually published a paper offering new insights into the Hodge conjecture. The paper sparked debates and brought attention to our work, though Dr. Evan Doyle openly criticized it, fueling further tensions within the department. In my second year, I continued refining our research, often using Hank as a sounding board. When my office was moved next to Hank's, it was a sign that I was being groomed for his position when he retired. Gaining tenure was another milestone, though Doyle opposed it, accusing Hank of favoritism. An independent review cleared Hank, but the whole ordeal clearly took a toll on him. When I became an associate professor, my previous position opened up again. To avoid further criticism, Hank formed a hiring committee, which included Doyle. Doyle resisted any candidate who had shown support for either Hank or me. Then Sandra Perry entered the scene. Her credentials and charm immediately impressed everyone, especially Doyle. After she left the room, Doyle couldn't stop raving about her, and Hank and I agreed she'd be a good fit. Sandra became the new assistant professor. As we left the meeting, I suggested to Hank, "Give her my cold, drafty classroom." He raised an eyebrow. I added, "With her looks, every guy in the room's going to need a cold shower." He laughed, keeping my classroom for me but reassigning my freshman courses. At Hank and Maggie's annual party, I noticed Sandra alone, her wine glass empty. I introduced myself saying, "Hi, I'm Andy Miller." She smiled and responded, "Hello, Dr. Miller. It's a pleasure to work with you." "Call me Andy," I offered. "Miller suits you," she replied. "Call me Sandra." Hank joined us, chuckling. "Andy, you're more than just my poor lunch buddy now." He then offered Sandra a tour of the party, adding, "Let's go track down my wife in this crowd." Watching them walk off, I couldn't help but feel a void. Throughout the evening, I found excuses to cross paths with Sandra, making small talk each time. Eventually, I brought her another glass of wine and spotted her talking to Doyle. When I handed her the wine, she thanked me warmly, though Doyle gave me a dark look before dismissing me from their conversation. Not wanting to cause a scene, I joined Maggie, who seemed to share my apprehension, watching Sandra and Doyle with a frown. "This is the first time Doyle's shown up at one of our parties," she observed. "It's obvious why he came," I replied. "Where's Hank?" I asked. "Hiding in the shop, disgusted with Doyle," she answered. "Are you going to join him?" she asked. I shook my head. "No, but tell Hank I'll meet him tomorrow at the office. We can work on that BSA bike in the evening." Saturday arrived, and though I was at the office, I couldn't shake Sandra from my mind. Frustrated, I went to Hank's workshop. "About time you showed up," he teased. "I had to replace you with a new mechanic." Sandra was there, dressed casually, clearly enjoying Hank's company. Sandra and Maggie decided we should all go out to eat. "And it's your treat," Hank continued with a laugh. We agreed and headed to a cozy Italian restaurant. It overlooked the usual dress code for Hank, who was a regular. The bill was steep, but sitting next to Sandra made every penny worthwhile. Later, at a jazz bar, I asked Sandra to dance. As we swayed, she leaned back and said, "I should be mad at you." "Why?" I asked, confused. "You left me with Doyle," she replied. "He made my skin crawl and told me to follow him home." I apologized, and she softened, saying, "You could make it up to me by taking me out on Friday." Soon, we were dating exclusively, though Doyle continued to pester her. She joined Hank and me in our research on the Hodge conjecture, though Doyle frequently tried to disrupt our work. He even tried to offer his help, but Doyle's efforts to drive a wedge between us failed. After that school year, Sandra and I got married. For 4 years, I was blissfully married to the most wonderful woman. I enjoyed my work, my friendship with Hank, and even managed to restore a 1969 Harley-Davidson Electra-Glide. The only remaining challenge was the Hodge conjecture, which still eluded me. One day, feeling frustrated with my calculations, I began thinking about how to make math exciting for kids. It struck me that elementary education was falling short, especially in math. That's when I got an idea: to create entertaining math shows for children, using the university's broadcasting system and involving celebrities. That Saturday night, we went to Hank's place for a barbecue. After dinner, I brought up my idea. "Guys, the way we're teaching math to kids is failing them. We need to make fun, engaging shows that cover the basics," I explained, outlining how we could use the university's broadcasting setup and bring in well-known figures to make math enjoyable. The idea caught on quickly, and I saw the excitement growing in Hank and Sandra's eyes. I envisioned them as co-hosts. Once everything was in motion, when the show premiered, it was a hit, getting syndicated nationwide and generating revenue for the university, and a share of that for Hank, Sandra, and me. Hank and Sandra became recognizable figures, while I worked mostly behind the scenes, scripting episodes. This break from the Hodge Conjecture brought welcome relief. I even co-authored several math textbooks, and Sandra and I began discussing the idea of having children, but she felt the timing wasn't quite right. Unexpectedly, Hank announced he was stepping down to emeritus status and recommended me as his replacement. I felt a mix of pride and sadness at the thought of taking his place, but I prepared myself for the promotion process. At the open hearing, just when I thought things were going smoothly, Reyes Cook, a former student, leveled a shocking accusation against me. She claimed I coerced her into an affair. I denied it vehemently, but the committee allowed her to speak. I saw the tear-streaked face of Sandra, and a wave of devastation washed over me. Reyes's roommates supported her story, and Sandra left the room before they'd even finished. When it was my turn to defend myself, I denied the allegations and demanded an investigation, but it was too late. The committee decided against my promotion. I left the hearing only to find that Sandra had packed her things and was gone. I went straight to Hank. He was shocked and outraged, encouraging me to fight back, but my focus was on finding Sandra. Despite all my efforts, I couldn't locate her. To make matters worse, the university appointed Doyle as interim department head and stripped me of my office. Weeks later, I got a call from Maggie. Hank had died of a heart attack before I could reach the hospital. The funeral was a blur of grief, and afterward, Maggie decided to move to Florida to be near her sister, leaving me feeling utterly alone. Not long after, Doyle was officially promoted to Hank's former position. He summoned me to his office and made me wait for 2 hours before accusing me of plagiarism. When I asked who had made the allegation, he smirked and replied, "Your wife, Sandra." Another committee was formed, this time chaired by the dean, to investigate the claims. I brought an attorney and anxiously awaited Sandra's testimony. When she entered, she glared at me with pure hatred. As I tried to speak, my lawyer motioned for me to keep quiet. Sandra testified that I'd stolen research from Doyle with Hank's help. My lawyer tried but couldn't break down her story. She finished without so much as a glance in my direction, and shortly after, I was fired for plagiarism. 2 weeks. 2 weeks later, divorce papers arrived. At the deposition, I couldn't stop myself from interrupting to speak to Sandra, earning a contempt citation from the judge. Eventually, the divorce was finalized, with Sandra receiving 65% of our assets, the house, and 2 years of alimony. As she left the courtroom, Doyle was there to console her. Later, Sandra even sued me for the rights to the TV show. I threw the papers down, got on my motorcycle, and rode aimlessly. I didn't attend the hearings, so I assumed she won by default. With everything I'd worked for gone, I couldn't find a job in academia or business. Left with no options, I considered manual labor. Sitting in a coffee shop near Las Vegas, I decided to try my luck at the casino scene. I watched the games for hours, concluding that blackjack offered the best odds if I could master a system. Starting cautiously, I observed other players, then began to play. After 6 hours, I was up $3,000. It felt like a revelation. I checked into a casino hotel and crashed. The next day, I continued learning, picking up tips about comps, player cards, and blackjack techniques. I realized I needed to switch casinos regularly to avoid attracting too much attention. As I traveled between casinos, my earnings grew, and I managed to keep up with the alimony payments, mailing them through postal money orders and including notes begging Sandra to contact me. She never responded. To avoid carrying large sums of cash, I converted my winnings into rare coins at coin shops. After flights, I kept a small bank account to show traceable income for the IRS, but left as little trace as possible. Although I had some savings now, it wasn't nearly enough to retire on. 3 years passed since my disgrace, and when the alimony ended, I woke up the day after Christmas next to an escort I'd hired on impulse. I'd called Maggie the night before to wish her a Merry Christmas. A call that threw me off. "Maggie, just calling to wish you a Merry Christmas," I said. "Oh, Andy, it's so good to hear from you," she replied. "You should spend the holidays with me," she suggested. I laughed. "Santa and I don't exactly mix. How are you, honey?" "I was worried when I heard the news," she added, a note of concern in her voice. I frowned. "What news, Maggie?" After a long pause, she said, "Forgive me, Andy. I thought you were calling to commiserate. Sandra remarried." Her voice broke, and I was speechless. I'd held on to some hope that maybe one day Sandra might forgive me. "Remarried?" I asked, feeling numb. "Who did she marry?" "It doesn't matter, Andy. Let it go, please," she pleaded. But I insisted. Finally, she said it was Doyle. They had a baby last month. I mumbled that I had to go and hung up. Maggie tried calling back immediately, but I ignored it and went straight to the bar. I ordered top-shelf bourbon and called for an escort. 3 years without indulgence, and I could hardly believe Sandra had moved on. I downed bourbon until the escort arrived, agreed on a price, and found a strange comfort in the company of a stranger. The next morning, hungover and drained, I showered and headed to the lobby bar. Typically, I avoided drinking when gambling, but today was an exception. I planned to drink, hydrate, and rest. While sipping a Bloody Mary, watching the bustling crowd, someone sat beside me. I glanced over to see a familiar face, Meredith, an attractive brunette blackjack dealer from the casino. She was good with rookies, handled tough players with ease, and I always enjoyed her shifts. I'd often tipped her well, sometimes even playing a hand in her name for extra tips. Though we hadn't exchanged words before, we'd shared a mutual recognition. In her uniform, dark pants, white shirt, dark vest, and name tag, she smiled briefly before ordering. "Hey, Meredith, what'll it be?" the bartender asked. "Hi, Frank. Just a 7-Up, no ice," she replied. Frank placed her drink on a napkin. Oddly, she added another napkin beneath it, drank quickly, and slipped out, brushing her cup against mine as she left. I found it a bit rude, but let it go. When I reached for my empty cup, I noticed a message scrolled on the napkin beneath it. "They are watching you." My pulse quickened, but I stayed calm, covering the napkin with my hand and motioning for the bartender to clear the glass. I pretended to clean my glasses, discreetly pocketing the napkin and leaving some cash for my drink. Unsure whether I was actually under surveillance, I exited without incident. Back in my hotel room, I read the message again, then flushed the napkin, deciding to avoid gambling for the time being, hoping that a shift in my routine might either make the casino back off or lose interest. If they were watching me, I spent the day letting the TV play as background noise, flipping through channels without much interest. By the next morning, still uncertain, I knew I had to contact Meredith, somewhere away from the casino's watchful eyes. From a bar on the mezzanine, I observed her shift and noted she took the number 7 bus home. The next day, I rode several buses, checking to see if I was being followed, but no one seemed to be trailing me. 20 minutes before her shift ended, I boarded the number 7 bus. When she got on, I whispered, "We need to talk." Her eyes widened in recognition, and she quickly got off at the next stop. I followed her into an IHOP, where we found a table. She spoke first. "I wondered if you'd contact me," she said. "When I didn't see you, I thought you'd left town." I leaned forward, anxious. "Who are they? Why are they watching me?" Meredith settled back in her chair. "You know why. They think you're counting cards." "Then why haven't they gone after me?" I asked. "Because they're not certain yet," she replied. "They're watching to be sure. You don't fit the usual profile. You play at low-stakes tables. You don't make big moves even when the odds are favorable. And sometimes you even make dumb bets and lose money." Just then the waitress arrived, and we placed our orders. While waiting, I thought of more questions. "How did they even notice me?" I asked. "Hard to say," she replied. You're just on their radar. And how did you find out about it? I pressed. She sighed. They asked me to keep an eye on you. I studied her for a moment. So why warn me? She hesitated. I started working at the casino to save for college, but then I got pregnant, and my boyfriend became abusive. I left him and struggled to get by. A few years back, I reported a lucky player to security, and they took him away. I got a raise afterward, but I heard rumors about what happened to him. I didn't want that kind of guilt on my conscience again. Our food arrived, and as we began to eat, I looked at her. How can I trust you? She held my gaze. You can't. After we finished, we ordered more coffee. So I'm on their radar, but not in trouble yet? I asked. That's right, she confirmed. I slumped back, considering my bleak prospects. What's wrong? She asked. This was my last shot. Gambling was supposed to be my way out. Why? She asked, and I explained my life story and the scandals that had led me here. After a pause, she suggested, why not switch to poker? I don't know how to play poker, I admitted. She looked at me surprised. You've been making money at blackjack, but you don't know poker? I shrugged. Blackjack is simple. You just beat the dealer or let them bust. I've never learned poker. In poker, you're up against other players, not the house, she explained. Casinos don't care if people count cards at poker tables. Plus, poker is played with one deck per hand. I consider the benefits. Teach me, I said impulsively. She looked doubtful. And you leave in a few weeks, right? She asked. I'll make it worth your while, I replied. I'll rent an apartment in your name for a year, paid up front, plus $500 a month for lessons. I'll cover all expenses, so no rent or daycare costs. That's $6,000 right away, plus a free place to stay. She thought it over carefully, then finally nodded. Deal, she said. The next day, after her shift, I met Meredith to help her and her daughter move out of the trailer park at 7:00 p.m. I drove a U-Haul into the park, feeling uneasy under the watchful stares of the residents. Meredith and her daughter quickly approached, each carrying a large duffel bag. They climbed in, and with a nervous look, Meredith urged me to get moving. I pulled out of the park swiftly. Her little girl clung tightly to Meredith, looking scared. Is this everything? I asked Meredith, concerned. That's all we've got left, she replied. Anything decent was taken long ago. That was my first real glimpse into the challenges they'd faced. After a short drive, we arrived at the apartment I'd arranged. I handed Meredith the key, and they carried their bags inside. The little girl, full of excitement, explored the empty rooms. Meredith explained how their belongings had been stolen bit by bit, and all they had left was what fit in those bags. Mommy, only one room has furniture, her daughter noted. Meredith introduced her to me, and after an initial shyness behind her mother, I said, I thought you'd have more stuff. That's why I rented the truck, I told them. Tonight you and Pamela can take my room. I'll sleep on the floor out here. Tomorrow, we'll get some furniture. Meredith hesitated but agreed, and they retreated to the room, locking the door behind them. I settled down on the living room floor, spending the night in discomfort. In the morning, I woke to see Pamela staring at me before she quickly scurried away. Meredith asked, Did you sleep? Oh, Meredith. I stretched, trying to ease the stiffness. Like a rock, I replied sarcastically. Pamela's stomach growled, and I realized I hadn't stocked the kitchen. Let's grab some breakfast, then pick up furniture and groceries for your shift tonight, I suggested. At a diner, Pamela ate hungrily, and Meredith, looking embarrassed, explained their financial struggles. I told her she didn't need to explain. Pamela beamed when I suggested getting blueberry muffins to go. At the furniture store, Meredith gravitated toward the cheapest options, but I insisted on something better. Eventually, she chose a modest, well-made bedroom set. Pamela was thrilled at the idea of a queen-sized bed and her own dresser. What about the living room and kitchen? I asked, sparking another debate. Meredith insisted we didn't need anything fancy, but I stood firm. If you don't choose, I'll let Pamela pick, I joked, which made Pamela giggle. Meredith finally picked out some comfortable, simple pieces. I paid in cash and got a small discount, and then we headed to Costco for kitchen essentials, linens, and a few other items. I noticed Pamela admiring the electronics section, so I suggested Meredith and Pamela handle groceries while I picked up the other items. Knowing it was pointless to argue, she agreed, and they grabbed another cart. When I caught up with them at checkout, Meredith eyed me suspiciously. "Where'd you go?" she asked. "Impulse shopping," I said with a grin. She seemed apologetic, but I reassured her, and we pushed our loaded carts to the van. A passerby joked about us buying out the store, and I responded, "Takes this much to keep the kid fed," making Pamela laugh. Back at the apartment, we all pitched in to unload. Meredith surprised me with her strength, and we managed to get everything inside. When I brought in the home entertainment center, complete with a 42-inch TV, Xbox, and games, Meredith gave me a mock glare as Pamela cheered. "So that's why you disappeared," Meredith teased. Pamela was beside herself with excitement. "This is part of my teaching method," I joked, trying to sound serious. "When Pamela learns her lessons, she'll be rewarded." Pamela immediately started exploring each game with wide-eyed enthusiasm. Meredith left to get ready for work, and when she returned, she found me and Pamela on the floor assembling the new furniture. I turned it into a math lesson, having Pamela count screws and calculate parts. Meredith watched in amazement as we worked together. "All my life I've wanted to teach," I said, watching Meredith's reaction. She shook her head slightly, offered a goodbye, and headed to work. I spent the rest of the day assembling furniture, reinforcing Pamela's math skills while we worked. By the time Meredith returned, I had her bedroom set up. I knew she'd probably rearrange things, but I figured the effort might make her smile. I had burgers on the grill so Meredith could relax and enjoy listening to Pamela's enthusiastic retelling of our day. After dinner, Meredith gave Pamela a bath and put her to bed while I cleaned up the kitchen. When Meredith returned in an oversized t-shirt and sweats, she looked effortlessly beautiful. "Thanks for setting up my room," she said with a smile. "I hope you don't mind if I change things around a bit." We both laughed, and as we sat down, I showed her the nanny cams and explained how to access the feed. She looked at me seriously. "If I thought for a second that you'd hurt my child, we wouldn't be here. Your offer has been a lifeline for us. But if I'd had any doubts, we would have stayed in that place," she said, her blue eyes filled with clarity. "Now that you've been teaching Pam all day, it's time you learned something," she said, pulling out a deck of cards and shuffling. We started with 5-card draw poker as she explained the different hand rankings, from a royal flush down to a high card. I grasped the concepts easily, understanding the odds. We played late into the night, with her winning consistently. Finally, she called it a night, saying she needed sleep, and I headed to bed, feeling frustrated that poker didn't come as naturally as I'd hoped. Still, I was oddly comforted by the lingering scent of her perfume on the sheets. The next morning, I awoke to the aroma of bacon and eggs. Stumbling out, I found Pamela at the table counting Cheerios and practicing her adding and subtracting before eating. Meredith was at the stove, setting the table with a warm smile. Seeing them together in that simple, domestic scene struck me. It was the kind of life I'd been missing. All my meals had been alone, eaten quickly in public. A wave of sadness hit me, but Meredith's smile lifted my spirits. I sat down, trying to join in the light conversation, though Meredith noticed something was off. After breakfast, I kept myself busy with Pamela's math games to avoid any questions from her before leaving for work. Before leaving for work, Meredith gently asked, "Are you okay, Andy?" "I will be," I replied, lying a bit to reassure her. Weeks went by in this routine. Breakfast, lessons with Pamela, Meredith off to work, more lessons, dinner, Pamela's bedtime, and then poker training. We worked through various games, and though I picked up the rules, I kept losing. It made me doubt my investment in this arrangement, but I stuck with it. One night, while playing Texas Hold'em, I got a royal flush, but before I could place a bet, Meredith folded. Frustrated, I asked how she'd guessed my hand. She explained that I'd been giving away subtle tells that revealed what I was holding. That night marked the start of advanced lessons, focused on reading opponents, bluffing, and refining my strategy. Over the next 2 months, I continued teaching Pamela, who excelled in everything from basic math to early algebra. Meredith worried she might be bored at school, but I assured her that Pamela would thrive when the time came. For Pamela's school orientation, Meredith took the day off and asked me to join them. I could see how nervous she was, hovering over Pamela like a protective mother. Pamela, though, seemed thrilled and eager to join her new classmates. Just before class began, she surprised us both by giving me a big hug. Touched, I encouraged her, and she joined the other kids. Afterward, Meredith wiped away tears, and I suggested we spend the day at a park rather than head home. We wandered around the park, enjoying ice cream and sitting quietly on a bench. Slowly, Meredith opened up about how she and Pamela ended up in Las Vegas. She'd grown up with a father who struggled with addiction, kicking her out at 18. She moved to Vegas, met Arthur, and got pregnant. While Meredith worked at a casino, Arthur stayed home drinking and eventually got involved with meth. Things escalated until he became abusive, and after a police raid, he even threatened her from jail. She took Pamela, and we pushed our loaded carts to the van. A passerby joked about us buying out the store, and I replied, "Takes this much to keep the kid fed," making Pamela laugh. Back at the apartment, we all pitched in to unload. Meredith surprised me with her strength, and we managed to get everything inside. When I brought in the home entertainment center, complete with a 42-inch TV, Xbox, and games, Meredith gave me a mock glare as Pamela cheered. "So that's why you disappeared," Meredith teased. Pamela was beside herself with excitement. "This is part of my teaching method," I joked, trying to sound serious. "When Pamela learns her lessons, she'll be rewarded." Pamela immediately started exploring each game with wide-eyed enthusiasm. Meredith left to get ready for work, and when she returned, she found me and Pamela on the floor assembling the new furniture. I turned it into a math lesson, having Pamela count screws and calculate parts. Meredith watched in amazement as we worked together. "All my life I've wanted to teach," I said, watching Meredith's reaction. She shook her head slightly, offered a goodbye, and headed to work. I spent the rest of the day assembling furniture, reinforcing Pamela's math skills while we worked. By the time Meredith returned, I had her bedroom set up. I knew she'd probably rearrange things, but I figured the effort might make her smile. I had burgers on the grill so Meredith could relax and enjoy listening to Pamela's enthusiastic retelling of our day. After dinner, Meredith gave Pamela a bath and put her to bed while I cleaned up the kitchen. When Meredith returned in an oversized t-shirt and sweats, she looked effortlessly beautiful. "Thanks for setting up my room," she said with a smile. "I hope you don't mind if I change things around a bit." We both laughed, and as we sat down, I showed her the nanny cams and explained how to access the feed. She looked at me seriously. "If I thought for a second that you'd hurt my child, we wouldn't be here. Your offer has been a lifeline for us. But if I'd had any doubts, we would have stayed in that place," she said, her blue eyes filled with clarity. "Now that you've been teaching Pam all day, it's time you learned something," she said, pulling out a deck of cards and shuffling. We started with 5-card draw poker, and she explained the different hand rankings. I grasped the concepts easily, understanding the odds. We played late into the night, with her winning consistently. Finally, she called it a night, saying she needed sleep, and I headed to bed, feeling frustrated that poker didn't come as naturally as I'd hoped. Still, I was oddly comforted by the lingering scent of her perfume on the sheets. The next morning, I awoke to the aroma of bacon and eggs. Stumbling out, I found Pamela at the table counting Cheerios and practicing her adding and subtracting before eating. Meredith was at the stove, setting the table with a warm smile. Seeing them together in that simple domestic scene struck me. It was the kind of life I'd been missing. All my meals had been alone, eaten quickly in public. A wave of sadness hit me, but Meredith's smile lifted my spirits. I sat down, trying to join in the light conversation, though Meredith noticed something was off. After breakfast, I kept myself busy with Pamela's math games to avoid any questions from her before leaving for work. Before leaving for work, Meredith gently asked, "Are you okay, Andy?" "I will be," I replied, lying a bit to reassure her. Weeks went by in this routine. Breakfast, lessons with Pamela, Meredith off to work, more lessons, dinner, Pamela's bedtime, and then poker training. We worked through various games, and though I picked up the rules, I kept losing. It made me doubt my investment in this arrangement, but I stuck with it. One night, while playing Texas Hold'em, I got a royal flush. But before I could place a bet, Meredith folded. Frustrated, I asked how she'd guessed my hand. She explained that I'd been giving away subtle tells that revealed what I was holding. That night marked the start of advanced lessons, focused on reading opponents, bluffing, and refining my strategy. Over the next 2 months, I continued teaching Pamela, who excelled in everything from basic math to early algebra. Meredith worried she might be bored at school, but I assured her that Pamela would thrive when the time came. For Pamela's school orientation, Meredith took the day off and asked me to join them. I could see how nervous she was, hovering over Pamela like a protective mother. Pamela, though, seemed thrilled and eager to join her new classmates. Just before class began, she surprised us both by giving me a big hug. Touched, I encouraged her, and she joined the other kids. Afterward, Meredith wiped away tears, and I suggested we spend the day at a park rather than head home. We wandered around the park, enjoying ice cream and sitting quietly on a bench. Slowly, Meredith opened up about how she and Pamela ended up in Las Vegas. She'd grown up with a father who struggled with addiction, kicking her out at 18. She moved to Vegas, met Arthur, and got pregnant. While Meredith worked at a casino, Arthur stayed home drinking and eventually got involved with meth. Things escalated until he became abusive, and after a police raid, he even threatened her from jail. She took Pamela and moved to a run-down trailer park, trying to survive. Tears began streaming down her face as she shared her fears about losing Pamela. I dropped my ice cream and put my arms around her as she cried. Though some passers-by shot curious looks, assuming I was the cause of her distress, I reassured her, reminding her of her strength. She looked up at me with tear-streaked eyes. "Do you think I'm beautiful?" she asked, vulnerable yet defiant. "More than that," I replied, feeling my heart pound. "You're one of the most beautiful, desirable women I know. I only wish I had a chance with you," she said, blinking in surprise. "Why haven't you told me before?" she asked. I hesitated. "I'm just a washed-up professor surviving off casino wins. I have nothing to offer, and I'm a lot older than you. You and Pamela deserve better. Living with you, too, has been the best part of my life. And now I've probably messed that up by saying this," she said, smiling. "You finally went against your logical brain and took a chance. That's the right move." We kissed deeply until a police officer approached, checking if everything was all right. After explaining, we both laughed, feeling a new bond growing between us. Living together, we grew closer, even with Pamela around. She noticed the changes, asking to spend more time together as a family. My confidence grew as my understanding of human behavior improved, and eventually, Meredith declared me ready to test my skills. I accompanied her to the casino. An hour after she started her shift, I went in, feeling the familiar itch to play blackjack. But I spotted a security guard watching me and changed course, heading to the poker tables instead. I spent a week observing the players, noting their mannerisms and strategies. When I shared my insights with Meredith, she confirmed that the casino was still in wait-and-see mode with me. Meredith insisted on keeping up with our training sessions, hinting it was her way of contributing. We tried to progress our relationship when Pamela was asleep, but the physical tension between us was growing. I joked about letting Pamela have a sleepover with friends, but Meredith laughed, saying that was a few years off. We settled into our routine, trying to manage our building frustrations. Watching the poker players each night, I began to recognize patterns. The loud braggarts, the cautious strategists, the quiet pros, the superstitious types, and the charming women who played on their looks. I could pick up tells on most players, but a few seasoned pros remained mysteries. I knew I had to enter the game soon. My resources were thinning. I planned to sit in on a $110, $220 hold'em game that Friday night, a time when Meredith would be home with Pamela so they could have Saturday together. Rested and ready, I entered the casino and went straight to the poker section, spotting the usual escort trailing me to the table. I took my seat, hoping Meredith was right and that the casino would leave me alone as long as I played clean. I bought in and studied the faces around the table, wondering who would turn out to be the sucker in this game. By Saturday afternoon, I stumbled back to the apartment where Meredith and Pamela were watching a Pixar movie. Meredith looked up with concern. "Well?" she asked. I tossed her an envelope stuffed with $100 bills. She let out a cheer, hugging and kissing me as Pamela, oblivious to it all, joined in the hug. I told Pamela she could pick the restaurant for dinner, and we ended up at Chuck E. Cheese's. After ordering, Pamela ran off to play, while Meredith asked me about the game. "It went smoothly," I replied. "You trained me well. I saw the game unfold like a chessboard. I wasn't the biggest winner, but I did pretty well. A pro at the table recognized my skill, and we stayed out of each other's way. Security didn't hassle me, so I cashed out and came home." Meredith nuzzled against me. "Half of this is yours," I said, handing her a portion of the winnings. "You went above and beyond to get me here. We're partners now." Meredith's eyes welled up, but before she could respond, our food arrived, and Pamela rejoined us under the table. I felt Meredith's foot sliding up and down my leg, her silent signal of connection. To keep gambling from interfering with our lives, Meredith and I established some ground rules. I could only play when Pamela was occupied, or with Meredith, I'd buy in with a set amount, never chase losses, and any profits would go into a shared account. We made a commitment to a weekly family activity, and our physical relationship grew more intense, though we remained cautious with Pamela around. When I entered a satellite poker tournament, winning $225,000 and a ticket to the World Series of Poker, we celebrated with an Italian dinner, Meredith's choice this time. Back at the apartment, Pamela headed to bed, and Meredith and I started our usual cuddling on the couch. Then she surprised me by saying, "I want to play poker." "Meredith, you've got to be kidding," I said, incredulous. "I'm all worked up, and now you want to play cards?" She grinned, kissed me, then strolled to the kitchen table and grabbed a deck of cards. As she shuffled, an old worry nagged at me. She noticed. "What's wrong, Andy? Every time I shuffle, you get that look." "Just a feeling I can't shake," I admitted. "Well, let's keep your mind off that. We're playing strip poker," Casually, she continued shuffling the cards. The only sound was the shuffling as she dealt. Announcing she was all in, I called her bet with a dreadful hand, a deuce and a 3. She stood, shed her clothes, and revealed a stunning figure. Her eyes held a mixture of exhilaration and vulnerability. When I undressed, she seemed pleased. We moved to my room, and her responses were exactly as I'd hoped, her voice rising in breathless gasps. She clung to me, whispering, "Forgive me if I don't get this right. Arthur's the only man I've been with." I reassured her, and we surrendered completely to the moment. Afterwards, as dawn approached, Meredith returned to Pamela's room. Despite my frustration, I knew this was the start of something deeper. Our evenings became explorations of each other's desires, and we rarely slept unsatisfied. We believed we were keeping our relationship secret, but one stormy night, Pamela asked to sleep in our bed. We were clothed, and we comforted her through the night. The next morning, over breakfast, Pamela revealed she'd known for weeks. "I just don't understand why Mom can't stay in one bed all night," she said, sending us into fits of laughter. As the World Series of Poker drew near, I grew anxious about media attention. Luckily, ESPN focused on the high-profile players, keeping me under the radar. On my first hand, I was dealt pocket aces. I played coolly, building the pot with a few calls. The reveal showed 2 more aces and a king of clubs, giving me 4 of a kind. Several players went all in, and I followed suit, noticing the cameras zooming in on us. The other players revealed their hands, a mix of pairs and a full house, but none could beat my quads. The final 2 cards didn't change anything, and I quadrupled my stack, seizing control of the table. The first day ended with me as one of the chip leaders. I returned to the apartment exhausted. Meredith greeted me, thrilled by my progress, and pampered me with food and a back massage before tucking me into bed. The second day, I was moved to a new table, still in the lead. My confidence soared as I used my position to pressure the others. By day's end, I'd further increased my chip count, leaving frustrated players in my wake. Soon, I began attracting more attention, and an associate producer requested an interview. Reluctantly, I agreed. It was part of the contract. The interview was tense. I was curt, revealing little, leaving the interviewer flustered. As I left, I overheard someone questioning my difficult demeanor. Back at the apartment, I warned Meredith that trouble might be brewing. She told me to ignore it and concentrate on the game. Then, a media report hit, labeling me the disgraced professor leading the World Series of Poker. My past scandals were now public knowledge, and some players tried to goad me, but I maintained my composure and continued winning. The situation escalated when a news crew ambushed Meredith and Pam on their way to school, peppering them with questions until Meredith retreated with Pamela. They shielded me from this to protect my focus, but the stress on them was mounting while I quietly climbed the ranks. Meredith faced questioning at work, and Pamela endured teasing at school. Finally, I reached the final table. The tournament paused for additional TV coverage, and I agreed to a brief, factual statement about my past, declining live questions. I recounted my story, apologizing for my previous interview's behavior and explaining my desire to protect Meredith and Pamela. My voice choked with emotion as I pleaded for privacy for my family. When I got home, we tried to relax, knowing the final cash prize could be substantial. My interview aired on multiple networks, and, surprisingly, a persistent reporter found and spoke with Maggie, who corroborated my account. The reporter even attempted to track down my accusers, though I wouldn't learn about this until later. For now, I just wanted to spend time with Meredith and Pamela before the tournament resumed. I suggested a trip to the Grand Canyon, and we packed a picnic, enjoying a peaceful day. As we returned to the apartment, Pamela rushed inside ahead of us while Meredith and I retrieved our things from the car. A strange feeling washed over me, but before I could process it, I heard Pamela scream. Meredith and I rushed in, and there, in our living room, stood a tall, disheveled man holding Pamela, a large hunting knife pressed against her. "God damn it, Meredith! I'll end her if you don't back off," he shouted. Terrified, Meredith recoiled. "Please, Arthur, don't hurt her, please," she pleaded. It was Arthur. He'd found us. High on something, he'd apparently heard about my tournament winnings and had broken in, ransacking the place for cash. "I want the money," he sneered. "Give me all of it, and maybe you and this little brat will live. I'll leave a mark on you, but you'll live." Meredith, trembling, tried to explain that the tournament chips weren't real money, that we hadn't received anything yet, but Arthur wasn't listening. The drugs had him fixated. Each plea from Meredith only seemed to infuriate him further. I knew I had to intervene. "Arthur, I'm the one you want. I'll give you everything I have, just let Pamela go," I said, keeping my voice steady. "Recognizing me, Arthur?" I sneered. "I know you. You're the pathetic coward who stole her from me. Do you want her? Then you'll pay." Pamela struggled in his grasp. He raised the knife, its point dangerously near her face. I lunged, seizing his wrist, forcing him to release her. Pamela bolted to Meredith. "Run!" I shouted, tackling Arthur as he swung wildly. His prison-honed strength overwhelmed me. The knife sliced my skin, but I held my ground, buying them time to escape. Bleeding, I blocked the doorway, determined to protect them. Arthur reveled in my torment, his knife tracing agonizing lines across my flesh as my strength ebbed. Sensing his advantage, he shoved me aside, fleeing. With a final burst of energy, I tackled him, but he retaliated, pinning me. My vision blurred. I felt myself fading. I'd failed so many times, and now this. The last thing I saw was Arthur's triumphant sneer as he prepared the final blow. Then, I heard Pamela's voice, clear and desperate. "Don't hurt my daddy." Her words cut deeper than any wound. I clung to them with every ounce of strength remaining. A sharp, jolting shock surged through me, and darkness swallowed me whole. An incessant, irritating beep pulled me back. My mind struggled to grasp it until I opened my eyes to the stark white ceiling. Murmurs surrounded me. "He's coming around." A flurry of activity ensued. Then I felt Meredith's warm, gentle hand in mine, her tears falling on me. I tried to speak, but she smiled through her tears, shaking her head. I drifted off again. When I awoke, Meredith was still there, holding my hand in the ICU. She reassured me I'd lost considerable blood, needing stitches, but I'd be okay. Apparently the police had intervened before Arthur could finish me off. Soon, I'd be moved to a regular room. I attempted to speak, but I couldn't, and sleep reclaimed me. The next time I woke, I was in a different room, Meredith still at my side, though exhaustion etched her features. "You need to go home and rest," I told her. She refused, stating she and Pamela were managing fine. At the mention of Pamela, the memory of her scream resurfaced, twisting my face in pain. The last thing I heard was Pamela begging Arthur not to hurt her daddy. "I thought we'd become a family," I groaned. "Losing that's what hurts most." "We are a family," Meredith said, her voice firm. "Pamela was crying for you. You know how? I told you to go home, not to the apartment, but home. Anywhere we're together is home." Before I could respond, Pamela leaped onto the bed, crying, "Daddy! Daddy!" I embraced her, and the three of us held each other, tears flowing freely. The nurses respectfully allowed us some privacy. Once we calmed, Meredith filled me in. Arthur's actions had been captured on the nanny cams, securing him a lengthy prison sentence. The video had even made national news. The World Series of Poker organizers had contacted Meredith, asking if I'd continue. "What do you think, Meredith? Should I go back or just give it up?" I asked. She smiled, her voice soft yet steady. "I'm just glad you asked. This is your decision. Your family is behind you 100%. And so, despite my battered state, I found myself back at the final table, determined to see it through. I played conservatively, letting others clash as the blinds rose. One player, a classic bully, taunted everyone, including me, dredging up my past to get under my skin. I knew the organizers would reprimand him, but confronting him would only validate his tactics. So I let his jabs roll off, even his obnoxious win celebrations. Play continued. I managed to stay in the game, occasionally taking the blinds. Eventually, it came down to 3. The bully, a short-stack player, and me. The short stack went all in and lost, leaving just the bully and me. Showgirls paraded out trays of $100 chips, creating an impractical but dramatic pile in the center. It was one-on-one. The bully escalated his insults, crossing a line by calling Meredith a meth head. I warned him he could say what he liked about me, but my family was off limits. He smirked. I tried to focus, but memories of the Hodge conjecture intruded. He kept taunting, distracting me. I found myself mentally working through equations instead of focusing on the cards. When I managed to take half his chips with a full house, I sarcastically asked if he planned a dance, further enraging him. He insulted Meredith again, and I almost lunged across the table, pausing the game. Seeing Meredith and Pamela in the audience, visibly upset, I knew I had to maintain composure. I tried to center myself, visualizing Meredith shuffling cards during our poker lessons, her motions echoing equation solving. I was jolted back to reality by the realization I hadn't even looked at my cards. 5 million chips were in the pot. I glanced at Meredith and blurted out, "The conjecture!" Her expression shifted, as if she understood the weight of that realization. Without looking at my cards, I raised, unnerving the bully. When the flop came, I went all in, still blind to my hand. I walked to Meredith, embracing her as the uproar began. A heated poker game turned in my favor. I'd beaten the school bully with a jack-high flush against his straight. The room exploded with cheers as I was called back for the winner's ceremony. The bully stormed off, and after a brief acceptance speech, I traded the gold champion's bracelet for a handmade paper one from Pamela. We celebrated in a casino penthouse suite. With my win secured, I immediately requested legal pads, pens, and a laptop to document my mathematical breakthrough. 3 months later, an article titled "The Solution to Hodge's Conjecture, the Nylon Shift," co-authored by Dr. Henry Marshall and myself, was published. The mathematical community was abuzz, and Maggie Marshall and I were awarded $1 million for our contribution. CBS's 60 Minutes profiled me as the bad boy math genius, investigating the accusations that had plagued me years prior. One accuser broke down on camera, and others recanted their statements, revealing coercion by Evan Doyle and the dean. Doyle had used videotapes to blackmail the girls, even bartering grades for sexual favors. The accusers admitted to giving false testimony under duress to regain their videos. 60 Minutes aired clips of Doyle and the dean with the young women, followed by a tearful apology from one accuser seeking my forgiveness. The segment concluded with 60 Minutes' signature ticking clock. My phone wouldn't stop ringing after the broadcast. I screened calls, ignoring former friends and colleagues who had abandoned me only to offer belated support. Eventually, my parents called. Despite their earlier judgment, I listened. The only person I truly wanted to talk to was Maggie. We both wept, finally feeling the weight of vindication, although it came at a heavy cost. The university's board of trustees contacted me, offering a chance to return. I flew back with Meredith and Pamela, weighing several offers while waiting in the airport's VIP lounge. I saw Sandra approaching. Even after all these years, her beauty struck me. "Hello, Andy," she said softly, making my heart skip a beat. "Sandra," I replied, a rush of memories flooding back. She hesitated, then confessed, "I considered crashing the trustees' event, but Evan, the dean, and I are now persona non grata. His past is catching up with him. Some of his victims have come forward, even some from our marriage." She took a deep breath. "I left him. I'm taking my son back home to start over. I know I don't deserve it, but I'm asking you to consider us. We were so perfect together. I loved you deeply, but when I heard those accusations, I reacted poorly. I just wanted to hurt you back. You'd love my son. He's an amazing little boy. If it's not too late, would you consider giving us another chance? If not, I understand, but I need your forgiveness." "Sandra," I responded, stunned. "Seeing you brings back happy memories. In a perfect world, we might be able to start over." Her face brightened. "But we're not in a perfect world. Meredith may not have your sophistication, but she's my partner. She'd stand by me through anything. We're solid, and I can't imagine my life without her." Sandra's face fell. "I can forgive what you did to me. It led me to Meredith. But I can't forgive how you treated Hank. He loved you like a daughter, and you abandoned him. You didn't attend his funeral or support Maggie. You were part of the lies against him. So no, I can't give you what you're asking for. I hope you and your son find happiness. But without me." As Sandra began to cry, an attendant announced that Miss Nealon and our daughter had boarded. Sandra's eyes widened at the mention of Meredith's maiden name, recognizing it from my research paper. I turned and walked toward the Gulfstream jet, a perk from the trustees' event. Soon, we were cruising at 30,000 feet. Pamela, in my lap, was engrossed in her coloring book. I closed my eyes, letting go of the lingering pain from my encounter with Sandra. A gentle nudge brought me back to the present. Pamela needed my attention. She showed me her math scribbles, and I smiled, confirming her work was accurate. Satisfied, she returned to her coloring. Meredith, amused, was browsing for a baby bassinet on her laptop. I closed my eyes again, reflecting on how, Despite the imperfections of the world, finding your soulmate made every challenge, every risk worthwhile. Then I felt another gentle nudge from my little girl.